Hey everybody, I'm Vijay Iyer. I'm the, Franklin D. and Florence Rosenblatt Professor of the Arts here in the Music Department at Harvard. It's my privilege to introduce our inaugural speaker in the George and Joyce Wein Lecture Series in African and African American Music. Our guest is George E. Lewis, the Edwin H. Case Professor of American Music at Columbia University. He's a legendary trombonist, composer, improviser, and electronic musician, and he is also one of today's most influential scholars of music. As a composer and performer, Professor Lewis is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a 2002 MacArthur Fellow, 2015 Guggenheim Fellow, a 2011 United States Artist Walker Fellow, and the recipient of the 1999 Alpert Award of the Arts and multiple fellowships from the NEA. His creative work as composer, improviser, and computer installation artist is documented on more than 140 recordings, presented by the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, London Philharmonia Orchestra, Radio's Sinfonieorchester Stuttgart, I should have practiced these, International Contemporary Ensemble, Musée des Sciences et des Industries La Villette, Contemporary Art Museum Houston, and the 2010 Vancouver Cultural Olympiad. In 1971, he became a member of the close-knit community of hugely influential African-American experimental musicians from Chicago's South Side, known as the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which also included members of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, the pianist-vocalist Amina Claudine Myers, and NEA jazz masters Muhal Richard Abrams and Anthony Braxton, among many others. With an agenda of collective self-determination, a starkly individualistic composerly orientation, and a radical assertion of both Black identity and Black mobility, these artists exerted a seismic impact on the jazz community to the point of successfully destabilizing the word jazz itself as an adequate frame for their staggering range of musical creativity. Professor Lewis's widely acclaimed book, A Power Stronger Than Itself, the AACM and American Experimental Music, University of Chicago, 2008, received the American Book Award and the American Musicological Society's first Music in American Culture Award. Aside from its seismic impact in music studies, the book is currently providing the source material for George Lewis's massive and thrilling new composition, Afterward, the AACM and/as opera, which will have its world premiere next month in Chicago, is that right? George was an early adopter and innovator with electronics in creative improvised settings, as witnessed on one of his celebrated early recordings, 1979's Homage to Charles Parker. The saxophonist composer Steve Coleman tells the story of his first encounter with George Lewis at a jam session on Chicago's South Side in the mid to late 1970s. There was a brisk round of solos and collective improvisations in which George distinguished himself as, quote, a different kind of cat, and that's a compliment, by the way. Steve had never heard the trombone played like that, so afterward, he made a beeline for him and asked, "So man, what are you working on?" George's reply began, "Well, I have this robot." I've known George for 20 years. He played key roles on my dissertation committee, my first album, and most of my thinking about improvisation, technology, race, and culture. My current graduate seminar here at Harvard, Theorizing Improvisation, was mostly cribbed from his forthcoming edited 2-volume Oxford Handbook of Critical Improvisation Studies, a sprawling new meta-field of which it is fair to call him the patron saint. In this way, George has always been ahead of his time. As an artist and a thinker, he embodies the prophetic quality of music, the tendency that Jacques Attali described of music being precisely that which hearkens the larger shifts in culture as a whole. George has inaugurated entire fields of scholarly inquiry and artistic practice. He has created community among unprecedented cross-sections of interdisciplinary communities and has made music that inspires audiences to rethink the fundamentals of musical experience. The timely title of this 2-lecture series is Black Liveness Matters, Tracing the Sounding Subject. And today's talk draws its title from the Czech science fiction author who coined the word robot and the legendary 19th century African-American piano virtuoso, Karel Čapek means Blind Tom. Please welcome my friend and mentor and hero, Professor George Lewis.
Thank you, sir. You're welcome. Thank you. Am I on? Is this on? Thank you. Let's see, is this on? Yeah, it's sort of a little loud. We're just testing right now. And I have to this is my crib sheet here. The title actually came from a concert that you did. We all, the Black Lives Matter, is it a movement or is it a slogan, whatever it is, it's obviously very important. And, I've become so annoyed when people say, well, all lives matter. And the obvious answer is, well, why aren't you acting like it? It's absurd. But anyway, when you did that concert at, in fact, a lot of these things come from you. I'm not going to say too much. Remember the one at BAM where you had all the people and they were just lying out there dead? And then they got up and said, Black Lives Matter. It was like, it was incredible, So in a way, this is partly your doing the title of the series of the lecture. And beyond that, you reminded me, Professor Gates, that about the time we all went out to George Wein's house, right? And you played, and your daughter and my son, who were both born 2 months apart, were hanging out and, listening rapidly to the music. Well, not always listening rapidly. Sometimes they were talking, I mean, they were like 5 or something. Anyway, so there's a lot there, and I'm very honored to, be the inaugural George and Joyce Wein lecturer, and also to come to Harvard and be in the company of all of you. And besides thanking Professor Gates and Abby Wolf and Matt Weinberg of the Hutchins Institute, and then there's the estimable Professor Ingrid Monson, without whom, who's capable of, as I've told her, capable of parting the waters and making all kinds of things happen. And so thank you very much for, there are a lot of other people, so I'd like to thank for this. But now let me tell you about this image here. This is Noah Purifoy, who I was introduced to by Adrian Yennick, who is currently dean of one of the arts programs at ASU West. And we used to go out to his house at Joshua Tree, and all his artwork was there. It's amazing. If you go online, you see it's like an art park. It's with sharp edges. It's kind of dangerous, and the community complains about it, but it's fantastic. And it's got things like this in it. And I felt somehow out of all the images I have of Noah's, this somehow fits. I mean, Blind Tom is kind of, as you can tell, being a pianist, he's kind of got the majority. But if you look up in the corner at that head, that's the RUR reference sitting there, at least as I see it, in my mind. Also, the last thing I wanted to say is that it turns out that I get to be next fall the professor in the Department of Music. So I get to be here for a whole semester, and that's great for me. Thank you. Brother, and maybe longer than that. Well, you never know. But it's just amazing. The music department here has really welcomed me in all kinds of ways, and I wanted to give a shout out to them as well. This talk is a bit experimental. I'm just going to tell you. It's a bit, I wouldn't want to say this is a, what do you call it, a WFF, well-formed formula. It's not a woof, it's more like a wootuf. And I'm going to take you to some interesting places. So we'll see what happens. There are a number of loose ends that I'll be at pains to tighten up, but unfortunately not today. But we're going to start here. In 1920, the Czech writer Karel Čapek, and I just came from the Czech Republic, so in a way, doing the opera, a version of the opera in the Ostravades Festival 2015, sort of piqued my interest, meeting with the director, the composer, and the conductor, Peter Kotik, and talking with him about Čapek and about Thomas Masaryk. And there's a wonderful book of conversations between the two that is an interesting thing that I found has been translated, so it's something I want to look at a little bit later. Well, Čapek a very diverse writer, but one of his first early successes was RUR, or a play. It's a play that has exercised a lasting international influence. It posed interaction and conflict between human capitalists and a new source of labor, the robota, which has come down to us in various languages as robot. And you can see right there, roboti and so on. I don't read Czech, but there you are. Čapek portrayed Rossum's universal robots, RUR, as artificial biological beings, not mechanical beings. This is before the age of computers. They're artificial biological beings designed and built in special laboratories and factories to perform work that humans no longer needed or wanted to do. Eventually, these human-built and soon enough human-enslaved artificial people, like the golem in Jewish folklore or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, they exceed the limits of their programming and use the sentience they somehow acquired as, they bust up the joint and they threaten good order. And in fact, Rossum's universal robots eventually destroy the human race, which didn't turn out so well for them. It was a fit of pique that really screwed them up. But it's beyond the scope of my talk today, but you should read the play. It's extraordinary. The reasons behind Čapek's choice of the Czech word robota has been lost to, I think, a number of English language critics who have been content to perform a basic translation of the term as forced labor. However, it's evident that Čapek drew upon a critical moment in Eastern European history, the abolition of serfdom. The institution of robota, or labor tax, functioned over 400 years as a key element in the Bohemian version of serfdom, and similar systems were active all across Eastern Europe and beyond. Peasants were required to give the lord and owner of the land a certain number of days of labor per week in return for permission to live on and work the land, very much after the fashion of the American sharecropper. And this is just one of the many parallels I'm going to try to tease out today. Inevitably, the robota system came under pressure, and in response, various land reforms were instituted. In 1975, Joseph II's attempts to abolish serfdom entirely were partially thwarted, leading to a form of neo-serfdom which persisted until the final abolition of the robota system around 1848, an interesting year because you also have the Italian Revolution and so on. Although Čapek's play doesn't directly refer to the institution of chattel slavery, in its various European and American forms, as one character in the play puts it, I wanted to turn the whole of mankind into an aristocracy of the world, an aristocracy nurtured by billions of mechanical slaves. Thus, we can propose a number of parallels to the condition of slaves under the US chattel system that stand out at various points in the play. This is actually more about John Stuart Mill, and this is something I'm continuing to come back to. In On Liberty, there's a passage which he wonders, quote, supposing it were possible to get houses built, corn grown, battles fought, causes tried, and even churches erected and prayers said by machinery, by automatons in human form. You can look it up. In RUR, society has already been radically transformed by the new robotic technology in ways that recall the immense transformations in the economy of the American South wrought by Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Čapek's characters debate undesirable alternatives to robot-driven economic and social systems in terms that recall the centuries-long contention over the reform of the robota. And this is a quote from the play, and there'll be a few of those. Helena, there's several characters. I may not read the names of the characters, it may not be that important. And what do you think would happen if we suddenly did stop making robots? That would be an enormous blow for the people. Well, why a blow? Well, because they'd have to go back to where they've been. And this dialogue actually precurses contemporary US concerns over how agricultural and service work would be performed in the absence of immigration, legal or otherwise, as satirized in Sergio Araújo's 2004 film, A Day Without a Mexican, in which Californians wake up one morning to find out that all persons of Mexican ancestry have disappeared. I'm not good at Spanish, but the gringos are going to cry. And there's another one in the English language where it says, well, who's going to do all the work now? Not long after the appearance of Arau's prescient film, business classes in Georgia and Alabama woke up to an actual daymare as a consequence of state legislation designed to force undocumented workers to leave the state. As crops rotted in the fields, pursuant to legislators' fanciful belief that the self-deported would be replaced by good old-fashioned Americans willing and able to work hard, Georgia tried to solve its problem by using prisoners as robota. Chapek presents the equivalent of house robots who do the cooking and field robots who work the farms and factories. The following passage shows that in such systems of domination, gender typing becomes integral. A woman asks, Helena asks, maybe it's stupid of me, but why do you make female robots when gender has no meaning for them? Well, it's a matter of supply and demand. You see, housemaids, shop staff, typists, people are used to them being female. So that's the Bruchel Tower of Babel. Maybe for those who know about that, you art people. A related kind of divide-conquer technique is exposed later in the play that recalls strategies used to divide ostensibly free persons in the New World. One of the industrialists says, there won't be just one factory anymore. Each factory will produce robots of a different color, different hair, different languages. The robots will be strangers to each other. They'll never be able to understand what the other says. And we humans will train them so that each robot will hate the robots from another factory all its life, all through the grave, to eternity. We'll be making Negro robots, and Swedish robots, and Italian robots, and Chinese robots, and if anyone ever talks to them about organization and brotherhood and, excuse me, I think I'd like another drink now. As Chapek's dialogue puts it, making an artificial worker is just like making a petrol engine. The simpler you make the production, the better you make the product, and of course, the cheaper as well. In this way, the strict delineation of the robot's place of unswerving servitude in the system of labor is enforced. The admonition to African Americans, to the well-known admonition to know your place, constitutes an indelible cultural and historical mark that arguably persists to this day, and we'll see some examples of that later. However, for both robots and African Americans, knowing your place is dependent upon a certain refusal of subjectivity in terms of interiority and the capability for independent expression. The inventor of the robots was said to remove all aspects of sentience that were not useful for the purposes of work. That's to say, the dialogue says, that's to say, he threw out the man and put in the robot. Robots are not people. They are mechanically much better than we are, and they have an amazing ability to understand things, but they don't have a soul. In other words, robots are objects, pure and simple, but this provides yet another occasion for me to consider Fred Moten's provocative observation that, quote, the history of blackness is testament to the fact that objects can and do resist. First, Moten resolves the implicit paradox of the resistant object through discursive means. That is to say, by object, he means the black American defined as such under the conditions of chattel slavery. Second, resistance can take many forms. Increasingly over the centuries, bohemian serfs chafed at the imposition of the robota, and strikes and rebellions were by no means uncommon. Chapek's scientists recount an analogous dynamic in the workings of the robots. A couple of times, not very often, mind, they have shown some resistance. Nothing in particular, it's that sometimes they seem to sort of go silent. It's almost like some kind of epileptic fit, a robot cramp, we call it. Or sometimes one of them might suddenly smash whatever it's in its hand, or stand still, or grind their teeth, and then they just have to go on the scrap heap, that's all. Well, in any system of domination, resistance or rebellion can be discursively redefined as a glitch. And the sudden appearance of tooth grinding is clearly just a technical disorder, some kind of fault in the production. Oh, no, Helena says. That's their soul. Well, do you think that grinding teeth is the beginnings of a soul? Well, we can solve that problem. Dr. Gall is carrying out some experiments right now. In asserting that subjectivity is, quote, this is Moten talking, defined by the subject's possession of itself and its objects, Moten's important insight is that this subjectivity can be asserted sonically, tracing that sonic subject, through what he calls the historical reality of commodities who spoke. of laborers who were commodities before, as it were, the abstraction of labor power from their bodies, and who continue to pass on this material heritage across the divide that separates slavery and freedom. Now, in the U.S., between 1800 and the Civil War, as music historian Richard Crawford notes, most African-American music was made by slaves, while the use of the drum by slaves was outlawed in many states, along with other, quote, loud instruments that plantation owners feared could be used to literally drum up conspiracies and rebellions. Silencing was not the only strategy deployed by the slavery system, and in any case, its application was inconsistent. On many southern plantations, the ubiquitous work songs were mandated as a part of the overseer's surveillance strategies. In other words, if they're singing loud, we know what they're doing, and we know they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. At least we think we know what they're doing. So, on occasion, slave musicians would somehow break out from these restrictions, and perhaps the most celebrated example is the sightless composer and virtuoso pianist Thomas Wiggins, born under slavery in 1848, who became popularly known as Blind Tom. You can see there singing in German, playing two pieces of music at once, performs with his back to the instrument, sings in German and French, does all incredible things, you know. There are many contemporaneous accounts of Tom's prodigious abilities, and I'd like to point out just two. First, we have an 1860 account of a performance cited by Alan Locke that recalls the young Mozart. He could play flawlessly any composition he heard played. Usually on once hearing it, he could improvise correctly and expressively, and is said to have had a repertoire of several thousand pieces. Another contemporaneous account from 1860 gives us Moten's sounding commodity. Our readers will remember a recent news item giving an account of a musical prodigy in the shape of a blind Negro boy owned by a Mr. Oliver of Georgia, which, the property, plays the piano intuitively. The property plays the piano. You see, that's very nice. Now we've got the sounding commodity. With surprising power, a friend who knows Mr. Oliver and is well known to the public writes the following enthusiastic account of his performance. The boy is an ugly little nigger till he touches the piano. Then the sightless eyeballs seem to be searching in the stars, and the great opera ear seems to be catching harmony from the celestial spheres. I'd never heard such power, such emphasis, such marvelous fingering and sweetness from the touch of Thalberg, Hertz, de Meyer, or Gottschalk, and yet this is just an ugly little cornfield nigger of Georgia. That's one of Blind Tom's pieces, and you can still get them on the internet or you can buy them in stores. He wrote a lot of pieces, and they're sheet music. And we're going to get to the sheet music part in a moment, but I want to take a little detour here. There are a lot of detours. In fact, when I finish detouring, you may not know where you are anymore. You have to get out Google Maps. Don't get it out here. If it wasn't for Kelly Jones, I wouldn't have gotten here. Now, I want to talk a bit about the Allgemeine Theorie der schönen Künste, the general theory of the fine arts, by Johann Georg Sulzer, who proposed that we should be able to hear Begeisterung, that is, inspiration or enthusiasm, Geist meaning an infusion of the spirit, in Beethoven's improvisations. That is, if we had been there. Sulzer understood that inspiration proceeded from the music itself, and not only from a perceiver's response, and was particularly excited about an English builder's 1749 plans for a piano that would convert Fantasien, as they call them, i.e. improvisations, into written notation. Daphne Brooks has luminously called Blind Tom's performances sonic slave narratives. At the same time, Tom's narratives, like Beethoven's, were also set down in written form, as we just saw, as notated compositions committed to paper by editors. I'd like to suggest that just as we can hear the traces of Beethoven's improvisation in his piano sonatas, for one example, hints of Blind Tom's sonic narrative are present in his written compositions. In his 1863 work for piano, The Battle of Manassas, Tom deploys the classic American trope of musical depiction, as thunder, lightning, and the sounds of cannons are recalled via cluster-like sounds that anticipate early Henry Cowell, the futurist composers, and the avant-garde artist Stan Douglas's use of La Marseillaise in his groundbreaking 1992 video installation, Or Chant. And I just want to put in a little bit of, I thought it might be interesting to hear a bit of Stan. That's the installation, which is a double-sided video installation. That's Douglas Ewart, one of the actors in the installation, Stan Douglas above there, and we're going to juxtapose those two people with the sound of Blind Tom. Now, if you know, for example, the 1912 piece by Henry Cowell, The Tides of Mananaun, the similarities are really, really striking. So that's sort of part one of what I have to say today to you, looking at these forms of prescience. I want to get a bit to a new novel that has come out about Blind Tom, a historical novel by Jeffrey Renard Allen called Song of the Shank. Has anyone ever read this? Anyone read Song of the Shank yet? You should all run right out and get it. It's just amazing novel. It's very sonically sensitive, and it probes the relation between sound and soul in the context of 19th century American conceptions of black subjectivity. Early on, Allen's white characters confront the challenges Tom's music poses to their conception of that subjectivity. One of Tom's owners wonders, can he wish? Can he aspire? Can he set goals? Other than in the bodily longing of a chicken desiring feed, a bird desiring a worm, a duck drawn to a pond? Other than in the set demands of nature, essentials such as the changing of the seasons or the earth's need for rain? There's a very interesting parallel there, just getting off the grid for a second. If you read James Sneed's article on repetition in black culture, where he's talking about Hegel's conception of the African as being close to nature, the circadian rhythms of the earth, and how those kinds of being that is a sign of the primitive, and so that's something that we see also as in Allen's retelling, in a way, dramatic retelling of these notions of black subjectivity. Now, in RUR, a musical performance is marked as quintessentially human. Someone's asked, do you play the piano? Yes. That's good. But a working machine must not play the piano, must not feel happy, must not do a whole lot of other things. For Chapek's industrialists, man is a being that does things such as feeling happy, playing the violin, going for a walk, and all sorts of other activities which are simply not needed for weaving or calculating. Thus, Chapek's robots are fated to only limited subjectivity. In Chapek's words, they learn how to speak, they write, they do arithmetic, and they've got amazing memories. If you read a 20-volume encyclopedia to them, they can repeat it back to you word for word, but they never think of anything new for themselves. They'd make good university lecturers. For Moten, the truth about the value, oh yeah, that's something of, there's that whole thing about, machines grading papers, and there's a big petition out against that, That's one of the Tuskegee syphilis archive photos. For Moten, the truth about the value of the commodity is tied precisely to the impossibility of its speaking. For if the commodity could speak, it would have intrinsic value. It would be infused with a certain spirit, a certain value given not from the outside. In Allen's novel, as in Tom's actual life experience and reception of his music, debates about originality versus mimesis in The Negro congeal into a complex of paradoxes, all prompted by Tom's undeniable soundings. Now, this is something that comes from the novel, but we could also imagine it being something that Jeffrey actually put into, drew from the archive. Between us, we have arrived at a scientific examination of a Negro boy who goes under the name Tom, a slave boy who was approximately 7 years of age and is fraught with all the handicaps of his race, but who can also demonstrate elevated and refined musical sensibility at the piano. He possesses the muscular ability to reproduce by hand and voice many of the finest selections from the European catalog. This is in and of itself remarkable, since the Negro's thought organ generally is a lifeless and submissive receptacle with no power or specific reaction to anything challenging or demanding that might be introduced to it. So much so that the Negro's imitative abilities are usually little better than those of a parrot. The emerging resolution of these paradoxes is that Tom, like any Negro, is doomed to mere mimesis and state of nature essence rather than the originality of the creative spirit that makes the complete human. The basic tenor of that side of the debate, is most crystalline form, is on offer in Mein Kampf. From time to time, our illustrated papers publish, for the edification of the German Philistine, the news that in some quarter or other of the globe, and for the first time in that locality, a Negro has become a lawyer, a teacher, a pastor, or even a grand opera tenor, or something of that kind. It is a sin against the will of the eternal Creator to allow hundreds of thousands of highly gifted people to remain floundering in the swamp of proletarian misery while Hottentots and Zulus, what was that? The Proust of the Papuans and the Tolstoy of the Zulus? Yeah. Ugh. Ooh, it's an ugly place to skate on. It's like a tightrope we're walking here. Are drilled to fill positions in the industrial professions, in the intellectual professions, excuse me. For here, we have the product only of a drilling technique, just as in the case of a performing dog.
Where's that quote from?
That's Mein Kampf.
Oh,
Yeah, it's mine from Mein Kampf. I read that many years ago, and I thought, boy, did I really read that? I guess I did. Let's get around to liveness. We want to talk about liveness mattering. We want to talk about black liveness mattering. So we're going to get around to, we haven't talked about liveness itself yet. Philip Auslander, who's probably the most influential theorist of liveness in sound, portrays the concept of live music as a discursive response to a crisis brought on by advances in the technology of recording, which led to radio listeners' inability to distinguish between live and recorded performances. The word live was invoked to contain this crisis, in his words, through a revised discourse that could pique the imagination of listeners. In other words, it's live, man. It's not, we're not, this is live. It's coming to you live from so-and-so and so-and-so. In the early 1960s, advances in recording technology allowed the binary opposition between live and recorded to be exploited to lasting effect by a young audio engineer, Edgar Vilchur, whose fledgling speaker company, Acoustic Research, based here in Cambridge, by the way, was made famous with its staging of live versus recorded concerts in which human musicians would perform live with a pair of Vilchur speakers behind them. During the performance, the musicians would stop and the tape performance would go on. Many reviewers of the day could not tell the difference between the live and the recorded sound. However, the use of classical music for these demonstrations, they used the Fine Arts Quartet, for example, that was one. The use of classical music was not just for the purposes of attracting well-heeled, high-class customers. Jazz was only one of the musical genres in which LP records of live performance was prized, but jazz's particular claim to liveness here was based, Adorno notwithstanding, on its reputation as improvised and spontaneous, being made in the here and now. You Are There, as the title of one 1950s TV show had it. Performance instructions for a piece of classical music constitute, in one sense, a storied program for the recovery of stockpiled time and could easily be juxtaposed with analogous stockpiling on tape. Such comparisons could not be performed with a music like jazz, which was improvised on the spot in both major and minor details. However, by 1972, audio equipment companies had figured out how to use jazz, or the image of jazz, to invoke the live versus recorded binary.
She did it. You are now hearing the Memorex cassette tape recording we just made of Ella. Is it Ella? Or is it Memorex?
I'll never tell.
She says, I'll never tell. So, You know, I used to play a lot more music than I do now, but around sometime in the 80s, I was playing with actually Steve Lacy, and it was Steve Lacy who introduced me to RUR, by the way, and also stuff like Zamyatin and Wein and novels of that kind, these dystopian Eastern European novels, which he was really a real devotee of. But sometime in the 80s, we were playing at the New Morning Jazz Club. I don't remember when this was, but anyway, the opening act before us was this guy playing a barrel organ, you know. And let's see if I get this guy. Yeah, he looks a little older now. He had a beard back then. But instead of the usual popular and folk songs and military stuff you find, you know, if you go to like Amsterdam on like Koopavond on Thursday or on Saturday, there are people there with the barrel organs and stuff like that, you know. What happened to my, oh, there we are, good, we're back. This guy had like Chick Corea and Thelonious Monk on his barrel organ. So. Well, you know, it's got a stored program there, and it's sort of like a player piano. And he cranks it. It's our pianola. He's cranking it, and the stored program's got the music on it. Or you find that also in like Conlon Nancarrow's studies for player piano. Or player pianos were big in the 1910s and 1920s, and people used to buy recordings on player piano of Paderewski and these super virtuosos. I think there were Gershwin piano rolls. They're all and you put those in your and you listen to them at home just like you listen to recordings. But these, most of the time you saw barrel organs, even today, it's like people in the street using them to do things. But this guy, I don't know where he got these rolls, maybe he put them on himself. But he had all these things on there. The audience loved this guy, you know, and like, it was like, wow, we have to go on after this guy. And the thing was, he didn't, and our music was, you know, going to be really different, as you said. That's another kind of cat. I mean, they love this guy. And so we went backstage because we got the idea after a while. I was sitting back there with everybody, and we're trying to figure out what was going on with this. You know, it made sense. You know, I'm doing a lot of work with computers, even right back then in the 80s, and I was actually working at the Computer Music Center, IRCAM, in Paris, and it made sense for me to venture this since the guy was just turning a crank, you know. I mean, he wasn't turning a crank really sensitively, he was just, or like, you know, dramatically. He was just kind of turning and smiling. It was sort of like ventriloquism. And so the guy was turning a crank, and the sounds were being controlled by a stored program. The whole thing could have been done by a computer, right, or a robot. Somebody else said that the barrel organ had an acoustic sound presumably naturally richer than the sounds of synthesizers. And someone else said, well, no, that couldn't be it, because remember Chick Corea on the Mini Moog, he played all those solos. It sounded pretty good, right? People were very excited by that. And these synthesizers could only make sines and sawtooth waves, very simple stuff. So maybe it was the intelligence, the Begeisterung, animating the sound, enlivening it, that counts at least as much as the sound itself, or even becomes a part of the sound, this echoing sulsur. Now, eventually, though, we had to conclude that the guy turning the crank that kept the audience interested. In other words, you know, not that, he was, as I said, he wasn't doing that much, you know. It was the visual marker of performance. I mean, the crank could have been a fake. That's what we figured out, you know, it could have been a fake. I mean, the performer, I thought about getting one from my computer. You know, I get a crank and I stick it on there, and the computer's just playing, but I'm turning this fake crank, you know. That actually happens in Amsterdam, by the way. A lot of the barrel organs are actually fake. They're electric, and so the guy's turning, but nothing's happening. It's all being controlled by a computer, you know. And so another thing could be there could be a real-time robotic composing process going on while you're turning the crank, and somehow turning the crank makes that happen. Now, I'm going to venture that all of these possibilities could give the impression that a live performance was taking place, and that such an impression is grounded in the imputation of human physical presence, i.e. liveness and activity, serving as a medium or source for musical communication. This is another one of my favorite pictures. From Alexander Scriabin forward, Western artists have sought to explore synesthetic links between sound and color. Now, in this 1988 painting by Jeff Donaldson, one of the founders of the Afro-Cuba art movement in the 1960s, what we find is the synesthesia of liveness. The steganographic images of Donaldson's longtime associate, Muhal Richard Abrams. For people who know Muhal, can you find him in the picture? He's a pianist. Nobody found him yet? How about Soul Brother #1? Can you find him? He's on the upper left. And on the right is Charles Clark, who was one of the early ACM bassists who passed away at the age of 25. And then there's this riot of color, and if you know about Afro-Cuba aesthetics, you know, color, riotous color, Kool-Aid colors, you know, what we're talking about in a way is a kind of jam-packed performative assemblage. And so I thought that I wanted to try making a version of this in sound. See how you like it.
Some like the show, some like the town.
Now, that was Muhal Richard Abrams and the late saxophonist Fred Anderson, two of the original members of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. Donaldson and Abrams were very close together at this time in the 1960s. You can see them both if you watch the film Medium Cool. There's a section in which Studs Terkel swears that he's going to introduce well, you know, it's on the DVD. You know, they're talking later about this scene in the film, and the director Haskell Wexler is saying, well, Studs said he was going to introduce us to these real black militants. You know, so they're going to go and they're going to meet these black militants, and then the black militants turned out to be Jeff Donaldson and Muhal, and so we're acting without a script, and they're just taking the total piss out of these guys. It's incredible, and they still didn't know. That, you know, how do these guys do? They weren't really performers. How do they do so well? You know. So, don't know what you thought about that, but I thought I'd draw that in as a kind of marker of synesthesia. Now, I'm about how long have I been going here? I got a little bit more to tell you guys. We have to get back to RUR in a minute. I wanted to talk a bit about interactive computer music. We've already talked about magnetic tape recording and musicians that play with magnetic tape, the live versus recorded thing. But then in the 60s, you get the advent of interactive electronic music, live electronic music, and you get scores that are more or less circuit diagrams. Now, this is a musical score by Gordon Muma for a so-called analog computer or responsive circuit, in which the Gordon Muma would play the French horn. That would be taken in by the system, and things would happen in response. Unless I miss my guess, Gordon is playing his French horn with a bassoon reed in it, or maybe an oboe reed. You know, that's the kind of sound you get if you do that. I've done it with the trombone. It sounds like that. But what you got here is Gordon treating an electronic feedback system as a quasi-independent co-performer. And the performance becomes a reciprocal mediation between the exhibited behaviors of human and machine actors. And that leads me to one of my favorite cute videos. Cynthia Brazil, who's, I don't know if she's still at MIT or not, down the street there. And it does appear to exercise a certain kind of awareness outside the limits of Muma's console.
Hello, Leo. Leo, this is Cookie Monster. Can you find Cookie Monster? Leo, Cookie Monster is very bad. He's very bad, Leo. Cookie Monster is very, very bad. He's a scary monster who wants to get your cookies.
Well, what we have here, I think, is a kind of composed liveness, a notion that I offer in the wake of Čapek, one that also moves away from the live recorded dichotomy toward an agency and subjectivity inflected view. And I'd like to invoke in that sense Benjamin Pickett and Jason Staniek's investigation of deadness as an alternative to liveness. Pickett and Staniek challenged Auslander's view of the connection between liveness and mediatization. They say, we see liveness as co-constituted with deadness, not as a result of mediatization, but rather as the necessary labor arrangement of intermundanity. In other words, the movement between two worlds. The connection between the worlds, the living and the dead, exemplified by Natalie Cole's unforgettable duet with her legendary father, Nat King Cole. Čapek also posits his characters as dependent upon a similar necessary labor arrangement between the two worlds, the humans and the robots, which, while not alive, are exhibiting aliveness. So now you get a chance. This is the audience participation part of the talk. Everybody knows about the blindfold test, right? This is the George Wein lecture. People know about the blindfold test, okay? It's,
99% of these people do not know what the blindfold.
well, you know, here's how it works. I mean, my dad, we used to, well, we didn't ride in a car, actually. Well, you know, we just walked around. I think we did it at home because we didn't have a car. Anyway, he'd say, there'd be somebody on the radio, he'd say, who's that playing? And I'd say, I don't really know. He said, well, I think it's Sonny Rollins. I said, well, I think it's Coleman Hawkins. And then you wait, and then the guy would say, that was Sonny Rollins. You got me again, you know. So that was it. You were blindfolded. You didn't know who it was. It was the blindfold test. So everyone was doing that, right? But the thing is, the difference between that and the jazz radio of today is that the jazz radio of today, you have to wait through 15 songs before they tell you anything. And then they tell you who's playing. So if you don't know who's playing, pretty soon you stop caring. And then you stop listening. And people are wondering why jazz is having problems. Just tell us who the hell is playing. It's an easy one, you know. And so they think that's boring, right? And on tenor, there was so-and-so, and on flutes. We want to hear that, you know. That's how we know what stuff to buy, right? Otherwise, it's all the same. We don't really know. But anyway, that's what the blindfold test was. And so that got appropriated by the journalists, particularly at Downbeat. And so what would happen is that they would bring in these famous musicians, and they'd play them these records, and they'd say, well, who is this? And sometimes they wouldn't know who it was. Sometimes they would know who it was. And then the other problem was they would ask the musicians to give their opinion on who was playing, which is the place where collegiality goes out the window, right? Suddenly, like, you know, I've seen people, you know, lose their friends, you know. Suddenly, one guy denounced the guy whose house he was staying at, you know. You know, things of that sort. So anyway, years ago, I made some cassette recordings of one of my, you know, I'm making these things, these computer improvising musicians performing by itself, and I ran into Lester Bowie, the trumpeter of the Art Ensemble Chicago founder, ran into him in the airport. So I gave him a blindfold test. I said, well, I put on the headphones, he listened for a while, and, you know, listening, he said, who is this? That was the right answer, not what is this, who is this? In other words, Bowie's query highlighting an effective affective network comprising liveness, sound, and subjectivity, but without the crank this time. So what you get here, this is your blindfold test, okay? You don't have to answer, just think about the question, who is this? Now, okay, got that? Before we tell you the answer, there's a commercial. And the commercial is for neuroscience. This is a 2010 paper by Chris Frith and Uta Frith called The Social Brain, Allowing Humans to Boldly Go Where No Other Species Has Been. And I think this covers ground that's really related to what we're talking about today in terms of its possible extension to human-machine communication by taking as its conceit the attempt by humans stranded on an alien planet to communicate with a previously unencountered species. This is, this Star Trek motif prompts a number of strategies, not for determining sentience, but for establishing communication and conveying an impression of autonomous agency. Now, first, you see, the authors observed that the social brain has a theory of mind, and of course, theory of mind studies that comes out of autism research, that enables us to predict what others are going to do on the basis of their desires and beliefs. It also, the brain has a mirror system, which enables us to understand others' goals and intentions and to empathize their emotions by a mechanism of motor resonance. Now, what you want to think about is, can theory of mind be musically heard, sonically performed, as well as detected and performed via gestures? I'm more interested in that part than in establishing a neurobiological basis for social behavior. That's why I'm interested in these types of signals, involuntary signals that we send off. According to Frith and Frith, one does not need to intentionally display, we don't need to display our biological provenance intentionally. We can't help doing it. Every time we move, we send out involuntary signals about ourselves, which they call public information, that tells others that we are agents. Experiments have shown that we can differentiate biological motion from other types of motion, and we can recognize gender and emotion from movement as well. Now, for example, the 1944 silent animation of Hyder and Simmel, where moving geometric shapes evoked attributions of intent in viewers, show that imbuing even apparently inanimate objects with intention is possible. This is from 1944. This is the Hyder-Simmel experiment in which they're looking at ways in which people routinely construct narratives and endow gestures with intent. In other words, we see these things as telling stories, and the story in this case is pretty clear if you look at it, at least for some of us. Now, okay. Now there's somebody sneaking up the side, and let's see. Okay. Ah. Gotcha. So, I mean, they're just triangles and circles and lines, but somehow, for some of you, I dare to say, based on your response to what I'm hearing, that you do seem to see certain kinds of intent or endowing these, imputing intention and goals and plans and affect to these simple triangles and shapes. According to Frith and others, in fact, we routinely make predictions and inferences as to what kinds of knowledge and belief these movers might have. There's the chameleon effect, in which promotes empathy via motor resonance. It's common in musical improvisation, for example, call and response, which we hear about all the time. On the other hand, when the other is a robot rather than a person, less motor resonance is observed. That's an effect that the scientists speculate may depend more upon beliefs about the nature of the agent than on its behavior. And that's a factor that, again, can also easily encompass differences in visible characteristics such as race and gender. So there are also voluntary signals that get sent out as well. Closing the loop, reciprocation, accommodation, resistance, and trust. In other words, you show your trust, you develop your reputation. So I want to consider all these things in the light of Andrew Pickering's ideas about the dance of agency, in which, with Bruno Latour, objects do perform Dances of agency, according to Pickering, are performative, not linguistic, not cognitive, or whatever. They have to do with actions, human and non-human, in the material world, and the interplay of those. And for Pickering, agency is emergent, in other words, emergent as a result of the interaction, in the brute sense of being unknowable in advance of specific performances. When you hear about agency being emergent, when you hear about indeterminacy and agency, you're in the presence of improvisation, and now the blindfold can be removed. Now, there's an interesting video online of Professor Iyer performing with another one of these doodads that I make. And you can go at Wellesley College, so you can check that out too and see that, you know, another part of the blindfold test. I think I want to move ahead a bit because I want to leave time for questions. And I want to talk a bit about the uncanny. Chopek's play, now this is the part where it gets a little sticky. A little political. Chopek's play is often interpreted as a critique of scientific irresponsibility, but it seems that a major danger, and this also turns up in Blade Runner if you've read that, or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, a major danger Chopek's characters saw in the emergence of the robots that they could pass for people.
Helena jumping up.
Oh, that's absurd. Sulla isn't a robot. Sulla is a girl like me. Sulla, this is outrageous. Why do you take part in such a hoax?
I am a robot.
No, you are not telling the truth. I know they forced you to do it for an advertisement. Sulla, you're a girl like me, aren't you?
I'm sorry, Miss Glory. Sula is a robot.
Now, Chopek's robots pursue imposture as a survival tactic, and the analogy to racial passing is too obvious to ignore. As Irving Goffman noted in the 1950s, the more closely the imposter's performance approximates to the real thing, the more intensely we may be threatened, for a competent performance by someone who proves to be an imposter may weaken in our minds the moral connection between legitimate authorization to play a part and the capacity to play it. So let's go a little bit further with Helena's astonishment.
It's a lie.
Excuse me, Miss Glory. Then I must convince you.
Enter Marius.
Marius, take Sula into the dissecting room and tell them to open her up at once. When they've cut her open, you can go and have a look.
No. You wouldn't have her killed.
You can't kill machines.
So this turn, late in our discussion, takes us in the direction of Masao Mori's notion of the uncanny valley, which asserts that as the behavior of robots becomes more and more human-like, that is, visually in Mori's formulation, a point arises at which they become less familiar to us and more uncanny, even to the point of evoking aversion. And it's occurred to me that this phenomenon of the uncanny valley extends beyond our encounter with robots toward any substantive exchange with entities previously regarded as subaltern objects who suddenly begin to speak. In the context of electoral politics, Barack Obama's ascension to the US presidency may be viewed as an example. Some partisans have continued, despite all evidence, and that's one of the fake birth certificates up there, to regard his occupancy of the office as simple imposture, again evoking extreme aversion. Both Rossum's Universal Robots and Blind Tom evoke the uncanny in their beholders, but the source of the uncanniness is in the beholders themselves and in their views on sentience. The aim of capitalists was to avoid producing sentience in the robots. The perspective of Tom's environment was to deny full humanity to him and others perceived as being like him, who chose not to accept the signals, the obvious signals of agency and subjectivity. And this is where we encounter the political and social dimensions that permit the current epidemic of dysfunctional police interactions with black citizens, which has everything to do with Obama and the uncanny valley. Now, I could also having, experienced this, we all are familiar of what you experienced, Skip, with that whole thing. And the fact that it probably wasn't the first time. My first encounter was at the age of 9, I remember. And I'm actually going to expect a similar uptick in violence against women if and when a woman is elected to the presidency of the United States. We have the experience of the former Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who related a conversation with current U.S. presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. She said to me that she never felt that issue about gender when she was a senator. It's when she put herself forward for executive office that she felt it very acutely. So, if the Hyder-Simmel experiments show that we can impute agency to inanimate objects based on gesture alone, surely we can do so for humans, or can we? According to Jeffrey Renard Allen, the late neuroscientist Oliver Sacks ascribed the discrepancy between Tom's everyday behavior and his apparent genius to autism, a view that at its most narrow, which I don't think Sacks is doing, but at its most narrow, would leave little room for the effects of racial dynamics. Allen's novel re-dramatizes the pre-20th century representation of Blind Tom as something akin to a freak of nature, not because of musical ability alone, but because of the evident provenance of that ability. I mean, they're saying that we find it impossible to account for these immense results upon any hypothesis growing out of the known laws of art and science. Remarkably, well after Blind Tom performed The Freak at the behest of P.T. Barnum, the gay black minimalist composer and pianist Julius Eastman referred to himself in a 1976 interview as a kind of talented freak. Talented we can understand if you heard him sing or if you heard him play, if you know his music. Talented we can understand, but what made him a freak? His extended vocal range, 4.5 octaves from a baritone to soprano, his blackness, his gayness. The remark evinces Eastman's understanding of his own presence on the American experimental classical music scene as an inherently counter-performative assemblage, just as Blind Tom's was. A particularly evocative paragraph that Daphne Brooks uses to describe Tom seems equally appropriate for Eastman. He is the noisy slave, the one who sounded outside multiple socio-cultural spheres. He is the heterophonic captive who, like his brethren who sang in response to and in conversation with one another, produced a symphony of sounds that span the dimensions of his environment. His sonic quality of doubleness is simultaneously complicit with and critical of the ideology of those who dominate him. Now, you have to mention, there might be a little bit more on this. Now, the fear of a Nat Turner-style rebellion was never far from the minds of Chopek's roboticists, and indeed their society eventually comes under attack from robots bent on throwing off human rule. A robot communique is intercepted.
Robots throughout the world, we, the first international organization of Rossum's Universal Robots, proclaim man as our enemy and an outlaw in the universe.
In an eerie echo of what has come down to us through the history of slave and slave rebellions, one of the industrialists once said, "Good heavens, who taught them those phrases?" But all robots sort of pretty much looked alike to them. We made the robots' faces too much alike, they said. 100,000 faces, all alike, all facing this way. It's like a nightmare. It was criminal of old Europe to teach the robots to fight. Some of the robots actually disobey the communique. One, named and fashioned after a human, begins to play the piano, even as her fellow robots burst in and massacre her human associates. Finally, we can connect the sentient-sounding commodity with Houston Baker's identification of two contrasting African-American expressive strategies: mastery of form, a cryptic masking exemplified by Blind Tom, that in Baker's words conceals, disguises, floats like a trickster butterfly in order to sting like a bee. And then there's Eastman's deformation of mastery, a phonetic strategy that distinguishes rather than conceals. It secures territorial advantage. It heightens a group's survival possibilities. And Baker uses primate behavior, in fact, the gorilla, as a metaphor. The gorilla's deformation is made possible, according to him, by his superior knowledge of the landscape and the loud assertion of the possession that he makes. And indeed, it was this raucous, post-Stonewall assertiveness that proved unsettling about Julius Eastman to many. Now, at one point in Jeffrey Renard Allen's book, Tom is asked, "How does it feel to be a nigger?" Tom's reply, "A nigger is a thing of no consequence." In contrast, Eastman, known for the titles of his pieces, Evil Nigger, Crazy Nigger, Nigger Faggot, saw the field nigger trope as the engine of radical change, and his sense of intersectionality draws him to evoke the same image by what he called the gay gorilla. That is the reason why I use gay gorilla, he says, in the hopes that I might be one if called upon to be one. Now, just as rebellion and resistance is the key to self-realization for Chopek's robots, there's a larger dance of agency that is the key to a range of expression from Blind Tom's sonic slave narrative to Julius Eastman's spiritual emancipation. Like most of my discussions on present and future sentient technologies, musical computers, self-driving cars, and military drones with the power of life and death, what I'm really talking about is the crucial place of critical Afro-humanism in charting our course. This lets us realize that Karl Čapek and Blind Tom are indeed meeting at the humanist crossroads where Eshu Elegbara awaits. That should do it. Thank you. Thank you very much. It went on. Sorry that went on for a bit. And as I said, it was kind of experimental. So if people want to ask questions or complain or whatever you want to do, it's,
Wow, George, that was fabulous.
Oh, thank you.
That was great. I just have two observations. One, that quote, the reason I asked where the quote about, that was from Mein Kampf, is that it's a repetition of Kant. The image of the parrot
right.
is from Kant. I mean, a black person just mimicking reason. It's from Kant in 1764, his observations on the beautiful and the sublime. So I've never read by him.
So he's channeling Kant.
He's channeling Kant.
Which makes sense because if you look at Emmanuel Eze's work on the Enlightenment philosophers, you start to see that was the dominant view.
Yeah.
And so it's an available trope, it seems, as you point out.
But the blindfold test was invented for Miles Davis.
It was?
And
I didn't know that part.
It was about racial authorship, not authorship.
Wow.
And I've written about this in the New Yorker. It was, I don't know, somebody can Google it right now. It was either Leonard Feather or... It was Leonard Feather. Miles Davis said that he could tell the race of any nonverbal artist. Meaning the way they blew the trumpet or the saxophone. And Leonard Feather said it's bullshit. And so they dropped the needle to sea. And Miles failed all the time, right? Yeah, and that was the blindfold test. And then it became institutionalized in Downbeat.
What's
just
hard
to see if you could identify who it was. But it really was about if you could identify the race of saxophonists.
And a black artist was made to say, oh, I guess you can't tell the difference. That was the point of Leonard
Feather. The funny thing is it's hard to know it's easier to see where the name blindfold test becomes used than it is to see where the practice comes from. And the practice probably predates jazz. I mean, if you think about it. I mean, how do we tell, for example, like someone like Stravinsky, you can say, well, is this Stravinsky or is this a cheap imitation? We don't really know, So certainly the institutionalization of a practice that, you're sitting, I've sat on the band bus in the Count Basie Orchestra, and, someone says, well, who's this? And they put the headphones on you. This is 1976. Who's this? I say, I don't know, man. Who is this? You don't know who that is?
Well, when I was...
Skip, it was actually Roy Eldridge, who was the one in 1951. Of course, I have it in my...
Oh, Roy Eldridge?
It was Roy Eldridge?
Yes.
Oh, it was Roy Eldridge, sorry.
I mean, the ones that said, well, I can always tell who the black ones and the white ones are. The black-white binary thing.
So Eldridge said it. Okay, that he could tell the race.
Yes.
Well,
I even have a full set of notes.
Okay, great.
Will not go.
But it was in Downbeat.
It was 1951.
With Leonard Feather.
Wow.
Okay, great. Well, I'm half right. But when talking about predecessors for the blindfold test, when I was a graduate student in English, we had to identify passages.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there would be a passage, a verse, or whatever, of a text, and you had to say the period it was from, who wrote it. So it was a blindfold test of another kind.
Yeah.
Questions, comments?
Don't be shy.
Ingrid Monson and VJ.
I actually didn't mean to raise my hand, but I just think this is just so wonderfully suggestive of all sorts of themes that are out there in the world now about theorizing improvisation and race and identity, and I just want to see more of it. You know, when you talk, the liveness and deadness, I think, is amazing. I would like, okay, I have a question. I will ask you if you can tell us more about what you mean by critical Afro-humanism.
Well, you know, it's something that I'm still trying to figure out what it is. I mean, you've got, you know, I mean, I look at you as being a person that's doing that, or Professor Gates, or a lot of people are doing this now. I mean, you could look at, who is it, the Afro-modernism of, you know, Leon Forrest, or who I'm trying to think of Kelly. Is Kelly still here? Boy, I can't, it's really terrible. Oh, Guthrie, Gad Ramsey. Someone like that. You know, people who are actually using this, asserting the importance of listening to black liveness, black voices as a crucial part of the conversation about where the future of humanity is going. And what we seem to find quite often is that those voices are things we sort of stick on like, well, after we've heard from everyone else, what do you guys have to say? And so I'm trying to really assert in a small way the centrality of what I'm calling an Afro-humanist perspective to discussions of technology in particular, because we were talking about issues of sentience, issues of subjectivity. We start to find that those conversations often rule out certain kinds of perspectives that are sorely needed. So it's something I'm still trying to figure out if it really makes sense to think in those ways, but it's a good start.
Can I ask one more question? Since there's so much talk about post-humanism,
Post-humanism?
since there's so much discussion about post-humanism right now, I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that too.
Boy, you know, I have a rough time with post-humanism. Yeah, you know, it's, I mean, I understand it. You know, I think I understand it. I think I'm finding that if we're thinking about the older models of integral subjectivity and subjectivity that doesn't involve technological inflection. In other words, we're all sort of sitting here in the West with about, each of us wears several computers. You know, I'm using one, two, everything around us has computers, the whole thing. The sewer systems that we run, by the way, which operate often on an algorithm called Harmony Search, which is basically modeled on a jazz trio. And so, if your sewer system breaks, it's because the musicians got mad or couldn't agree on what the right direction was. So we're talking about a situation which we're really imbued. If post-humanity means that kind of thing, well, I'm kind of all for it. But I think what's happening is that humanity is evolving to meet these kinds of new challenges. From the, we've got the business of the self-driving car, or I didn't talk much about the drones. You know, there's a big movement now to outlaw drones that have the automatic power to kill people, you know, because they can do that, right? Not just aerial drones, but also land drones. There are people that make these things, and they are patrolling parts of the world right now. You know, right at this very moment. And so we don't know what's going to happen there. But the idea that somehow a machine is going to make that important life and death decision is something I think requires the perspective of somebody who, like, you know, Eric Garner's mother needs to weigh in on that. You see what I mean? So that's the short form of that.
Did I break it? Hey, thank you for this fantastic tour de force. Whenever I ask a question after one of your talks, I just sound like a shill, so I'll try not to. But I wanted to ask you about the difference between what you called revulsion in the case of Uncanny Valley and the phenomenon of indifference, which gives rise to a phrase like Black Lives Matter. And there is a difference between indifference and revulsion, which seems to me to kind of matter here. I guess I want to throw in the idea, or what's been observed as the racial empathy gap. And I guess when you're talking about liveness and subjectivity as being imputed in the case of, say, inanimate objects like squares and triangles, but at the same time somehow being denied or revoked in the case of real Black lives, what's the difference there? It seems like it's more than something as simple as the uncanny valley. There seems to be another layer to it.
Let me think about that, because indifference, you know, the only way you can really be indifferent to something like that is if you've turned off the part of your humanity that deals with that kind of empathy, and that goes beyond the racial part of it to other deformations that the racial part of it bring forth. So I don't believe much in indifference. I believe rather that as we look at the progress, at least in certain media, of the Black Lives Matter movement, it seems that there's a decided effort to try to criminalize either Black liveness or those who protest against those who, the things that are happening now. So that doesn't seem like indifference to me. It does seem like aversion. It seems like militant, the kind of militancy I mean, if it's a militant indifference, but I don't think it is. I think it's kind of a deliberate attempt to deny these humanities. And so, you know, if it were indifference, I feel hopeful about it. At least I feel like I could take someone by the scruff of the neck and say, you have to pay attention to this. You know, but if it's like, you know, Fox News and people are saying, well, you know, we have to, you can't take them by the scruff of the neck. So no, I think the indifference is the minor part, and it's the hopeful part, because we really can't believe that people could be indifferent to that. So you're hopeful that they're not. But if I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I'm too pessimistic to favor indifference as the major term in the discussion. Yes, please.
Final question from Orlando Patterson.
Yes. Thanks for that very unusual talk. I mean, I'm still trying to absorb it, but I want to ask what I hope is not a provocative question, and that is, to whom is the expression, Black Lives Matter, addressed? Yeah, because my sense is that it's restricted. And my own feeling is that it shouldn't be. Restricted to whom? That it's addressed to whites and to you know, the criminal police activities and all the rest of it.
Okay, can you talk in the mic, because I can't hear it?
Yes, it's restricted to whites, it references the criminal behavior of racist police in taking Black lives in this brutal way. But my problem is that we miss the opportunity that Black lives are being taken in a horrendous way in this country, not just by the police, but by fellow blacks. And I like the phrase Black Lives Matters, and I want to move with it, but I wonder whether there's room for engaging the lives that we read about that are cut down daily, here in Boston and New York and so on. I'm concerned with the restriction of the term, and it's a kind of dehumanizing of the many thousands of black lives and the victims and the mothers and the sisters and the lovers who are left to grieve.
Thank you, Orlando.
No, I think that's a great. I don't know. Maybe I'm not on here. Maybe I'll go back to this thing. And I think that's an excellent point. I'm going to say that I'm not sure where the restriction comes from, because I wasn't aware that there was a single authority that was. I haven't seen one, and it seems to me that the meaning of the phrase is very much in debate right now. So I don't see yet the hegemonic viewpoint that restricts it to a given theater of operations, that is to say, racist attacks on police. And I could certainly see a young or older parent like me going to their child and saying, well, black lives do matter, including yours, and maybe your behavior has something to do with thinking about that. I could certainly see that, and I don't see that as being any kind of contradiction. What I am concerned with, though, on the other side, is that these two perspectives shouldn't compete, but they can coalesce into a larger sense of what that phrase means. And that's going to be a debate which is ongoing. But what I'm starting to see is that the attempt to impose a binary, whether it means this or it means that, or it means that you're ignoring, I don't know, what was the old apartheid term, black on black crime, or you're ignoring that and you're just talking about the police, you're talking about whatever. And so there's going to be, not being a public policy person, but still being a person who's vitally interested in this subject, I'm going to say that the scope of that concept is very much in question right now, and it's going to evolve, it's going to grow, it's going to, there are a lot of things going on, and I don't see a final answer right now.
George is going to continue part 2 of his lecture series tomorrow, not here, but over at the Harvard Faculty Club in the library at 4 o'clock. Please join us, and join us for food and drink at the back of the room, but not before giving it up for George Lewis for marvelous.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good job. Good, spectacular, man. Thank you.